Thursday, October 22nd, 1891. 41 Marlborough Hill, London, England. Breakfast in bed, papers brought, the Times, the Daily Telegraph, and the London Evening Standard. Accounts in the Times of disasters at sea make me very anxious to hear from my brother Vernon. Clyde Fitch's play at the court, Pamela's Prodigy, is a failure. Compton's Matinee has pleasant notices. I think much of poor Anne. If I could remember all or even half the queer things that woman has said and done, it would be a quaint history. Her reminiscences, her opinion, her tricks and her manners, her strange little ways of placating me when she had done something extraordinarily stupid, her occasional fits of sulkiness and disdain during which she would skate about with her head lifted loftily and her eyes fixed in a stony glare, and after which she would dissect my character and tell me plain truths. "You are the most impatient lady I ever came across," she would assure me. "You aren't let yourself get so excitable. It's bad for the brain." One night I came in a hurry for tea, and she was slower even than usual. I saw I'd never get it unless I stirred her up. Come, Anne, make haste. I've only got a few minutes and I mustn't be late. The Prince of Wales is coming to see me in Henry James's play, The American, tonight." "No, miss, really? Dear me, I shan't be long. The Prince! Well. And she skated about in such agitation I trembled for the few bits of china that were left. After she had brought me in tea, she hung about. "I hope he won't take a fancy to you, miss." "The Prince," she interrupted. "He's very fond of theater ladies." "Is he?" "Oh, yes, miss, very. I wish he wasn't coming to see ye." She looked as if she would burst into tears in another moment. "Oh, he doesn't care for serious actresses." "You ain't too serious, miss, and you got language." "Got what?" "Language, miss. That's what the Prince likes. Bless you, he's got a nice pretty wife of his own, but it's the language of these actresses the Prince likes. You see, you don't talk like everyday folks. I don't know how you do it. I can't do it. But you've got language, and when the Prince hears you, I don't believe he'll ever let you come back." I try to pacify her and send her to the kitchen. When I go, she follows me to the door. "I hope you'll get back safe, miss." "Don't be silly, Anne." I'll sit up for you." "Nonsense, go to bed." "Indeed I won't. I couldn't sleep thinking of you and the Prince. Oh, miss, I hope he'll let you come back." And I run down the stairs, splitting with laughter. When I get home, she's burning the midnight oil, the picture of strained anxiety. I am obliged to tell her the Prince seemed unmoved by my language and expressed no desire to prevent my return to Anne and my attic. She seems grateful for this self-restraint on the part of royalty, but her unfeeling remark is, "Well, I'm very glad. I didn't look to see you back, miss, but you see, the Prince is getting old." Welcome to the Elizabeth Robbins Diary podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Kaler. Following the death of Elizabeth's husband, which we will cover in a later episode, she decides to try to establish herself on the London stage. Her life in England would lead to friendships with writers like Henry James and Virginia Woolf, actress Marion Lee, suffragists like the Pankhursts and Evelyn Sharp, and publishers William Heinemann and William Stead. Though Elizabeth considered moving back to the United States several times throughout her life, England would remain her permanent home. In Season 1, Episode 1, I had the privilege of interviewing Elizabeth's biographer, Dr. Joanne Gates. In covering her life in England, it made sense to interview the other author who's written a full-length biography on Elizabeth. Dr. Angela V. John wrote the biography, Elizabeth Robbins, Staging a Life, in 1995. Each chapter is named after a book Elizabeth wrote. And like this podcast, Angela used Elizabeth's diaries and letters to create a picture of who Elizabeth was and how she wanted to be perceived. She will help us understand how Elizabeth ended up in England and what kept her there. But first, let's meet Angela. She worked as the professor of history at the University of Greenwich in London and is now an honorary professor at Swansea University. In April, she will publish her 13th book, including biographies of some of Elizabeth's friends like Evelyn Sharp, Henry Nevinson, and Lady Rantha. In fact, I've got a great photo from Harvard University of Elizabeth and Lady Rantha that I'll include in the show notes. In her free time, Angela serves as president of the Welsh People's History Society. Angela, thank you so much for taking time with us today. When you first published your biography on Elizabeth, there was almost nothing published about her life. How did you find out about her, and what made you decide to write her biography?
Well, I think the first time I really got to hear about her was when The Convert, her 1907 suffrage novel, was published in the UK. And I got hold of that. I used to teach women's suffrage as one of my courses, and I was just bowled over by the novel. And of course, Votes for Women, the play on which it's based. Really, that gave me an initial introduction to her. But what made me want to write her biography, I think there were probably several reasons. One was that I'd already written a few monographs on labour and women's history, but I'd just written my first biography, which was a study of an English woman who went to Wales and did endless things. She had 10 children. She ran the largest ironworks in the world. She was one of the world's leading collectors of china, and she translated medieval Welsh tales into English. So here was somebody who was, a real polymath and worked in a whole number of areas. But most of all, she kept a diary from the age of 9 until she was 79. And I think what really appealed to me was the idea of writing about somebody else, kept a diary for many years, lived to a ripe old age, saw a lot of changes in their lifetime, and actually achieved a whole number of different things. And of course, Elizabeth Robbins fitted the bill perfectly, because she did all those things, and in a sense, and more. I also had a good friend who still teaches at RADA, and I went to see a production in 1987 that RADA students did of Votes for Women.
Oh, wow.
So that was another impetus, and that was wonderful. Wow.
That would be amazing. I am so interested in seeing that second act produced. Just the chaos of that suffrage scene has just always, you just wonder how the director stays on top of that. It's just an astonishing piece.
And what was wonderful was that we became that crowd, the audience became the crowd. And it was a really electrifying atmosphere. So that was another impetus. I think also I've long been interested in both theatre and literature, although I'm a historian by training. And so this was a way of marrying all these different interests. And biography fascinates me. One of the things that I think really particularly got me wanting to write about Elizabeth is what a challenge she is, because she deliberately rejects people trying to find the real her.
Right.
She loves to mystify and play games, I think, with us. And there's a wonderful passage in the novel, in her diary, which I used in my introduction, when she talks about she has a constitutional unwillingness to letting people know what seems to myself to be the real me.
Yeah.
And she talks about, trying to confound people's expectations. And I saw that really as a challenge. And also because as an actress and as somebody who'd had a really rather tragic life, in both in her youth and as a young married woman, the horrors she went through, I think all of that made her particularly, in one sense, defensive, but also quite vulnerable. And it was the contradictions in her life that really interested me, and the way in which she liked to set false trails. So all of that, plus it was a wonderful opportunity to learn more about American history. I was able to come to the States, spent quite a long time in the Fales Library, over 3 years, parts of 3 consecutive years, where I also at one point met Joanne Gates, the author of the terrific biography. She was writing it. I met Jane Marcus, who'd done a PhD on Elizabeth.
Okay.
And so that was all, I think, incredibly rich and helpful. And then once I met the trustee of the Baxtertown Trust and the person who was looking after the Elizabeth Robins papers, the Honourable Mrs. Mabel Smith, Mabel was such a delight that I was absolutely hooked. I went to meet her thinking I'd probably be there for less than an hour in her flat in Wimbledon, and emerged hours later, kind of staggered out, really overwhelmed by her real love of what Elizabeth had stood for. And also Mabel had known Octavia and all sorts of people, knew Leonard Woolf very well, because he was one of the trustees as well. So all of that was really, it meant there was no going back really from that point onwards.
Right. No, and actually the piece that you referenced from her talking about basically cooking her books is actually the passage that I use in the first episode of the first one that we did, where I just say, okay, we're going to try to get to the bottom of this, but also she intentionally made it hard for us by literally ripping pages out and altering things. You'll see her go back in later years and change things in the diaries. And so, it used to frustrate me, and then I realized I would have done the same thing. So I can't really blame her for that. So another part of that's tricky with dealing with Robin's family is that they all go by several different nicknames. So when I first started working at Chinsegut, I was wondering why we had this binder full of letters from this lady named Gretchen. I didn't know who Gretchen was and why she was there so much. And it turned out that was Margaret Robin's nickname from her siblings. So every time she's writing to them, she's referring to herself as Gretchen. When you write your book, and there's actually a passage in your intro where you talk about Elizabeth's various nicknames, and then you use them to title different portions of the book. So what made you decide to do that, and what are some of the names that she went by?
Well, I wanted to structure the book so that it would broadly tell a chronological story so that dear reader wouldn't be too confused. But at the same time, because she had so many different interests, I thought it would be valuable as well to have a relatively thematic structure in addition. So in order to kind of manage that, I decided to break the book down into several parts, and obviously wanted to name the parts. And because she also decided to present different faces to different people at different times, and again was an actress. And by the way, although normally for today I call women actors as opposed to actresses, I think I retain the word actress for her because at the time that she was acting, she was known as an actress, not as an actor. Mm-hmm. So basically, when she was young, she was known as Bessie Robins. Then, when she was really at the height of her acting fame in Britain, she became known as Lisa of the Blue Eyes, and her great friend Florence Bell always called her Lisa. When I wrote one section called C.E. Raymond, and that was a pseudonym that she used, but of course it also refers to her brother. Mm-hmm. So I was trying to reflect the different ways in which I could break up her life. And at the same time, within those different parts, I gave each chapter the title of one of her novels. So, for example, the chapter that looks at her acting, I call Ibsen and the Actress, which was named after a piece she wrote all about Ibsen, a booklet. Time is Whispering, at the end of the book, reflects, of course, the 1923 gentle novel about older age and about an older couple and apple culture in Sussex. And it's a rather different tone from some of her earlier, rather more angry work, if you like.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think really what I was trying to do was to utilize her chapter titles And then within the broader structure of the parts, the different parts it broke down into, just to show how she meant different things to different people and really had a variety of selves, as she liked to think herself.
Yeah. No, and I think that's so wise and was such a great way to do it, because it's the same thing in the difficulty with Raymond, and part of why I think they potentially haven't been as remembered as they ought to be is they had their hands in so many different things as opposed to being known for one thing, that you always find them involved somehow in all of these other people's stories, but they did not singly devote themselves to one thing. And I do think that that has made a difference in how they're remembered. So the audience is going to know that she is starting her stage career in New York City when she's 19. She's still a teenager and heads off there. And she has a pretty successful career as a leading lady in classic roles, mostly Shakespeare and standard theater that people would expect. But how does she end up in London a few years later?
Well, I think the key to that is really the terrible tragedy of losing her husband at such a young age and in such a melodramatic fashion. Mm-hmm. And perhaps to some extent the guilt she must have felt given the history of that relationship. And after he died, I think she really was having to pull herself together in a way that was very demanding for her. She toured on the Coast to Coast tour with Barrett and Bruce on their famous Shakespearean tour. And she had a friend in Boston, an American woman, who was the widow of the Norwegian violinist Ole Bull. Mm-hmm. And she suggested to Elizabeth that she might accompany her and her daughter to the island of Lisen off the coast of Norway in 1888 in the summer to visit her late husband's home. He had bought the island and they'd had a home there. And she wanted her daughter to really grow up partly respecting her Norwegian heritage. And Elizabeth, I think partly as a means of getting away, of something, a change for her, agreed to go with her. And on the way there, they stopped off. She stopped off in London for a few days, her first visit to London. They then went on to Lisen and spent the summer there, where she acquired some Norwegian. She also, interestingly, of course, long before she really ever read any of Ibsen's work, found out about him having worked in the theatre in Bergen for some years, because Lisen is about 18 kilometres off the coast from Bergen. And actually, I went there when I was doing my research. It was amazing. I got a little boat out to the island and spent a day seeing where she'd spent that summer, which was really, it's a rather magical place. Anyway, at the end of the summer of 1888, she was about to return to the States. She actually had a part lined up in New York. But what happened was that once again, she went back via Britain, went back to London, and she was going to get a boat back to America. However, somehow she never quite made it, and she stayed the rest of her life. Oscar Wilde, of all people, was one of the people who really encouraged her to stay. She found the London theatre pretty vibrant, and she decided really to have a break and to, in effect, start anew, which was a very brave thing to do.
Mm-hmm. And there's a great autobiography of that period of her life, Both Sides of the Curtain, which I either had read it right when I first started researching her in 2015 and then just didn't remember enough of it to know that I'd read it, or I just read it for the first time last year. But it is so delightful and so many interesting people, and explains kind of how she crafted that first part of her career there. But it's a really, really neat book if people can get a hold of it. So she's fairly famous, or at least established in the theater world in America, but she is definitely starting from scratch in England. So who were some of the people that helped her make that transition?
Well, it must have been incredibly tough, I think. She knew very few people. She was already wary of the kind of overblown power of the English male actor managers and their perceptions of actresses. She knew of the great Ellen Terry, and she did meet her. But thanks to Oscar Wilde's connections and a loan from one of his cousins, she persevered, and she got some early parts understudying, and she was helped by new American friends in London, such as the actress Marion Lee. And just over a year after being in London, she took part in a benefit performance of the Pillars of Ibsen's The Pillars of Society. But she and Marion Lee both got parts in the controversial play A Doll's House. Marion Lee played Nora, and Elizabeth was Mrs. Linden. And the translator, William Archer, was one of the people who noted and was impressed by her early acting in London. So there was a beginnings, partly through American connections, but also through other people in the business, so to speak. She began she had to more or less start from scratch all over again, because people didn't really know about her work in America. But nevertheless, she began getting parts. And so by the beginning of the 1890s, she was beginning to establish herself and getting parts as an interpreter of Ibsen.
Okay, so you mentioned Ibsen, and her first role then was in A Doll's House with his performance. How does she become known as the High Priestess of Ibsen, which is such a bizarre nickname?
Well, it's really Hedda Gabler, I think, that makes her. I mean, it really made a difference. Part of the whole question there was that Hedda, and she played the first Hedda in English, Hedda was a disturbing figure even for the 1890s, when things were beginning to loosen up a bit. She was seen very much as an amoral woman, and people, of course, kept identifying Elizabeth with Hedda. And she herself did this some of the time as well.
Yeah.
The paper, The Stage, which was very influential, described Hedda as a beast degraded from womanhood, half an idiot and very much of a devil. One critic declared that she'd made vice attractive by her art. The point is that nobody could really ignore Elizabeth's impact once she had played that part. Never mind the fact that it was a limited run in the non-commercial theatre. It literally became the talk of the town. Also, Elizabeth had dared to stage this play with another woman. They were challenging the male actor-manager setup. They were putting up their own limited money so that they could launch it on the stage. And I think, she was highly intelligent as well as beautiful, so quite a threat to traditionalists. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, she went on to create the role of Hilda in The Master Builder. And in addition to a number of other plays, by the end of the 1890s, she'd performed in Rosmer's Home, Little Eyolf, John Gabriel Borkman, performed the fourth act of Brand, and done a copyright performance of When We Dead Awaken. So in a way, it's not surprising that she's given that label. She also, of course, wrote and spoke about the playwright, and she was convinced that he provided opportunities for women to bring out the best in the characters they were playing, to see them as multidimensional figures, and that she felt he enabled actresses to give their very best. So I think really she becomes identified. It's the early 1890s, mainly Hedda Gabler, but then consolidated in particular, I think, by The Master Builder. I think those two plays in particular have a huge effect and get her labeled in that way.
So we know that she gets past the fact that nobody knows her and establishes a pretty good career, but she also is a very relational person, and we're going to see throughout the course of her life that she develops really deep relationships. So whose friendship in England do you think are the most interesting, and why?
Well, there's a whole bunch of them, but I think I'd probably focus on three in particular. And they were Florence Bell, Lady Florence Bell, as she was, Octavia Wilberforce, and William Archer. Florence Bell is probably best remembered today, certainly in Britain, as the author of a social investigation published in 1907 called At the Works, which was based on the vast ironworks in the northeast of England in Middlesbrough that her husband, Sir Hugh Bell, ran. And in the 1980s, At the Works was reprinted. In fact, I wrote the introduction to the Virago reprint. And Middlesbrough is where the works were. It's a very different part of Britain from London, an area that was affected rather late by industrialization, but then really became what was called the infant Hercules. I mean, it became an area that was dominated by industry. Florence Bell is fascinating in the sense that, in many respects, Elizabeth Robin seems a very different figure from her. Florence was really quite a traditionalist, a stickler for convention, somebody who didn't really like rocking the boat.
Anti-suffrage.
Yeah, well, yes, she wasn't as anti-suffrage as her stepdaughter Gertrude, but nevertheless, she was not in favour of women's suffrage, and most certainly not in favour of the militant suffrage that Elizabeth Robins endorsed. So it seems a little strange in some ways, but what they shared was a huge love of the theatre. And Florence Bell, with her ladylike background, would never have been allowed to be a professional actress. She also was somebody who loved writing. So they had these cultural interests in common. And she was very impressed by what she saw of Elizabeth acting. They first met in 1891, and they also wrote together, and it was published and produced anonymously, a play called Alan's Wife, which was highly controversial because it was about infanticide. And this was a really taboo subject. And its reception in London, when it was performed briefly, caused really quite a stir. It's an amazing play. I've also seen students put that play on as well. So it really had quite an impact. Now, later on, just after Florence died, Elizabeth published a book called Theatre and Friendship, which was a book of correspondence, published it in 1932. And ostensibly, it was about her friendship with the great American Henry James, the great writer. But actually, over half the book is really about Florence Bell. It's
You're
interesting.
Right. I've never thought about that. You are so right.
So it's fascinating, I think, that it was in a way her tribute to her. And so I devote half a chapter of my book to Florence Bell. And partly because, again, I find Elizabeth so enigmatic and fascinating that these women with very different outlooks and lifestyles would be prepared to sublimate their differences for what they shared and for what they admired in each other, even though there were most definitely moments of tension. Another reason why I think Florence is important is that in Elizabeth's frenetic life, going to stay in the northeast, in the rather gracious surroundings of Florence Bell's home and with Florence Bell's own family, Elizabeth was able to take some vital time out and to just chill, as we say today, in a way that I think was not possible most of the time in these years when she was in London and very, very busy. So Florence Bell was certainly one of them. Octavia Wilberforce became the key figure in Elizabeth's later years. She's an interesting woman because I think she became the most important person in Elizabeth's life at a time when Raymond was slipping from her. I mean, when Raymond got married, clearly Elizabeth felt that dreadfully and felt she no longer mattered to him in the way that she once had done. And Octavia was quite needy. She'd had a difficult childhood, even though she was from a well-known family. And in fact, she was a descendant of the anti-slavery figure, William Wilberforce. She was related to Virginia Woolf as well. And she became quite an important doctor. It took her quite a long time to qualify, but Elizabeth, who had members of her family, you know, that the interest in medicine was really quite large in her life, in Elizabeth's life. And she was delighted that this young woman who was 26 years younger than her wanted to be a doctor. Initially, I think she saw her almost as a daughter. Later in life, their roles became reversed as Elizabeth became elderly, quite dependent on Octavia, who by this time was quite an important doctor with a medical practice in Brighton. And the relationship and the dependency shifted quite considerably. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, I think Octavia was central to Elizabeth's life. The most enigmatic and in some ways fascinating relationship of Elizabeth's many years in England was with the Scottish William Archer. This was an intense and passionate affair which developed at the same time as Elizabeth's espousal of Ibsen's plays. And of course, Archer was Ibsen's translator and an important critic of his work. Their relationship was necessarily kept secret, not least because Archer was married. And both of them were anyway essentially private people who were devoted to theatre, tried to camouflage their personal lives. But as I think I demonstrate in the book, ultimately Elizabeth wasn't as successful at that as she sometimes thought she was. And she kept masses of material. And certainly when I was reading her papers, I would find, scribbled on the back of some of her notes or a manuscript, little notes, passionate notes from William Archer, or she would be giving herself away, things that had escaped her beady eye, and prove, I think, incontrovertibly that, they did have this very intense relationship for a time. I'm not sure, though, that I buy the claim that has been made that in probably 1895, she might well have had his child. I don't think I would go that far. Nevertheless, I think it's definite that the two of them did have quite a passionate relationship at a time when she was also really quite lonely in many other respects. So those three, I think, are the three I would single out as being especially important in her life.
Yeah, no, and those are solid for sure. Tell me about some of the places that Elizabeth lived in England over the 50 years that she was there. And I especially want you to mention the flat that took 74 steps to get into.
Well, Elizabeth lived in a number of places. And when she was first in London, she lived in some not very wonderful lodgings, partly because she didn't have much money, but also she needed to be relatively near the West End so that she could get back late at night from her job, from acting. And when her brother Vernon came to visit, she did manage to find a slightly better flat, but it was one in Dorset Street in London, which meant that although it was a 2-bedroom flat, not only did she have to climb 74 steps to reach the front door, there was then a further ascent to the 3rd floor. So she got quite a lot of exercise. She lived in London until 1907, when she gave up the lease on a flat in Kensington. And then for almost 2 years, she shared a rented house in Surrey called Blythe with a friend of hers called Flora Simmons. But over the years, of course, she travelled quite a lot to America. She also went, as we know, to Alaska in search of her brother, and then put money into Chinsegut, which she and Raymond initially saw as their home until Margaret came along. But the reality was that despite retaining American citizenship throughout her life and seeing the Second World War back in America, she did basically spend most of her days based in southern England in the county of Sussex. And from 1909, home was a pretty 15th century house in the village of Henfield. Initially, she rented this house, which was at first called Backset Town House. But within a few years, she purchased it and it became known as Baxetown, one word, and the land surrounding it, and she renovated it as well. And in 1927, Baxetown was put to a new use. Elizabeth had suffered over the years health-wise in a number of ways, and she took quite a lot of rest cures, some of which were more successful than others. And Baxetown now became a convalescent home with a difference. It provided what was called a rest pause for professional women and for those with heavy domestic duties. And fees were kept as low as possible. It was administered by a trust, and Octavia and her friend Dr. Marjorie Herbert were in charge. Elizabeth acquired a central London home, but actually also spent much of her time in Brighton, where Octavia had her home at 24 Montpellier Crescent. Baxetown's now, by the way, a private home again, but it continued as a convalescent home long after Octavia's death in 1963. And I was lucky enough to stay there for a night when I was researching my biography. I even slept in Elizabeth's former bedroom, which was called Rafters. It had oak beams that she'd exposed, and it had been part of the original medieval hall. Breakfast was in bed, delivered on a tray. But the other people there were recuperating. So I had to abide by the fairly strict rules. No alcohol, food suited to invalids. So I remember jelly and blancmange and lights out by 10 p.m. On the shelves were Elizabeth's novels and her other books, including, to my amusement, a first edition of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, with Elizabeth's writing inside stating that it had been lent to her in 1941 by William James, Henry James's, psychologist brother.
Yeah.
Nephew, I think, wasn't he? And I've actually got it now because Mabel Smith, the trustee for the estate, left me Elizabeth's books. She left me a necklace of hers and her 4-leaf clover, which was meant to be for good luck. Elizabeth's own writings, her novels and the other writings went to the Women's Library in London. So I have quite fond memories of Baxetown.
I'm actually in the midst of transcribing her 1904 diary when she's in Germany under Dr. Lohmann's care. And it seems to me like a lot of what they do at Baxtertown models what Lohmann was doing with, a lot of bathing, a lot of air, a lot of exercise, and very specific diets that were a lot what they would consider more healthy than the ones where she was just only eating meat, or that rest cure where she had to lay there and do nothing all day. So yeah, we did an episode in the first season on her rest cure that she then wrote the novel Dark Lantern based on, and just what a terrifying experience that whole thing was. But the Lohmann experience so far in her diary, she seems very positive about.
By the way, I gave the Baxtertown minute books. There were 2 volumes of them, largely handwritten, and Leonard Woolf would be at a lot of these meetings. Mabel had given them to me, and I gave them to the Sussex Record Office, so people can consult them now because they are available to be seen.
Oh, wonderful. So we also in season 1 covered Elizabeth's role in the women's suffrage movement as president of the Women's Writers' Suffrage League. What can you tell us about her involvement with the Pankhursts and the WSPU, which means Women's Social and Political Union?
Well, Elizabeth and Emmeline Pankhurst, the leader of the militant suffragettes, had a certain amount in common, I think. Both were dignified, striking, and intelligent women who didn't suffer fools gladly. Mm-hmm. And both were committed to furthering women's rights and accomplished at impressing audiences. It was, for example, Elizabeth's first unscripted suffrage speech that converted the novelist Evelyn Sharp, whose biography I wrote, to becoming a suffragette. She found the impact of Elizabeth speaking absolutely shattering and said she would never see life again in the same way almost. So she clearly had an impact. Elizabeth, though, was, of course, more used to delivering other people's words than her own, although Mrs. Pankhurst assured her that she, quote, possessed the gift of personal magnetism in a far greater degree than I have by nature. Mm. Elizabeth sat on the committee of the WSPU, and I think Mrs. Pankhurst recognised the propagandist value of having the famous actress on board. And as you mentioned, she was president of the Elizabeth was president of the Women Writers' Suffrage League and a member of the Actresses' Franchise League. But in many ways, I think it was her suffrage articles, some of them collected in a volume called Way Stations, and her suffrage fiction, that I think it was there that Elizabeth really made a difference. Unlike the Pankhursts and many others, she was not prepared to risk going to prison. But when you think about it, this isn't surprising. She was not a British citizen, so she could easily have been deported. And all along, her friendship with well-connected individuals, some of them in government, complicated matters. This was especially so because the Liberal Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, who with his late wife Dorothy had long supported Elizabeth, was somebody who placed her, in a sense, in a very equivocal position. She walked a thin line between loyalty to such friends and being encouraged by Mrs. Pankhurst, and in particular her daughter Christabel, to give them bits of information and help elicit converts. Mm-hmm. And it was quite a dangerous game to play. Mm-hmm. When Elizabeth wore a white dress trimmed with violets, and the suffragette colours were purple, white and green, at a dinner at which the Prime Minister Asquith was present, apparently he remarked to her, "You're looking very hostile."
I love that.
And words, I think, rather than deeds, and of course the reverse of the WSPU motto, were Elizabeth's strength, especially in fiction. But again, things become quite difficult after 1911, when her tendency to make militancy sound reasonable by cloaking it with eloquent words alienated some. Back in 1909, for example, she wrote an article called Why? Much more hesitant. But by 1913, the title of an article is Women's War. So very categorical. And she's using words as weapons to incite others to deeds. And her mail was intercepted at this point. I mean, she was clearly seen as a threat. But at the end of the day, she did get troubled by what seemed to be an increasing resort to violence, with secret arson attacks as more moderate militancy failed to achieve the vote. There was a couple she got on with rather well called the Pethick Lawrences, another Emmeline Pethick Lawrence and her husband Fred, who had put a lot of money into the movement from the early days and been very supportive of the WSPU. But they too were becoming worried about the way that attacks on private property as opposed to public were threatening indirectly the lives. If somebody had been in an empty house, in what was thought to be an empty house but wasn't, it could have meant the loss of life. And in October 1912, there was a big split in the WSPU. It was known as the Pank split between the Pethick Lawrences and the Pankhursts. And Elizabeth, in fact, took the Pethick Lawrence line and wasn't prepared to go as far as the Pankhurst. Interestingly, she sent Christabel, who was in voluntary exile in Paris, a 16-page letter detailing her concern about the way in which things were going. And that provoked an even longer reply from Christabel, which I dissect in my book. But Elizabeth basically remained an active supporter of women's suffrage, and of course, post-war, continued to support the movement and feminism more generally, and was in touch with people like the American feminist Alice Paul in the 1920s and supported women's rights right to the end. And in fact, her rather angry, anonymous book, Ancilla's Share, spells out a lot of her quite strong beliefs.
So we have another famous woman that we mentioned earlier, Gertrude Bell, who figures into her life. How do you see their friendship changing each of them? How do you think that relationship impacted each woman?
Well, the intrepid explorer and highly intelligent Gertrude Bell, who was a stepdaughter of Florence, and so part of the family with whom Elizabeth spent a lot of time, was an interesting woman. Their friendship, again, was complicated. Both respected each other's ability, and at one point, Elizabeth took a holiday in Scotland with Gertrude. She helped to give Gertrude's work more publicity, her work, important work in the Middle East. Gertrude died quite young, most probably took her own life in 1926 in Baghdad. And the following year, Elizabeth did a BBC recording about her life and her role in the development of modern Iraq. But their outlooks, again, were markedly different on a number of subjects, and most notably suffrage. Gertrude was literally a member of the Antis. She was very much opposed to suffrage, despite the fact that she was an intrepid pioneer woman herself.
Right.
And as Elizabeth became more passionate and was writing, even though not taking action, in more strident ways between 1912 and 1914, so their friendship was increasingly under great strain. Both women, I think, could be obstinate and obdurate if and when they wanted.
Those are good words for them. I love that. We are calling season 2 The Making of Elizabeth. How do you think Elizabeth was changed by her time in Great Britain?
Well, I think Elizabeth was indubitably changed, but that would have happened anyway, given that she spent most of her adult life there. I mean, she'd have inevitably changed as she grew older, I think. She remained an American citizen, and although her suffrage years show her moving in wider circles than she had earlier, her connections and experience of British society remained, I think, overwhelmingly focused on the privileged. Most of her initial acquaintances were upper middle class or even upper class or part of the cultured intelligentsia. There's not much sense of her familiarity with the majority of the ordinary middle class or working class people. And in her early fiction, some of her early short stories in particular, working class people tend to feature primarily as servants of the titled and wealthy. So I think she was changed, but I think at the same time she retained a foothold on 2 continents. I mean, I believe she crossed the Atlantic about 30 times. Yeah. You think how long that would have taken. That's really quite remarkable. And I think as she aged, so she found adjusting between one and the other increasingly difficult because of the different cultures. So I think she was changed, but we'll never really know because she did spend so much time in Britain. We can't really tell how she might have changed or not changed had she stayed in the States.
No, that's very fair. Do you think that we can point to any way that Great Britain was changed by Elizabeth?
Well, I'm not sure that I claim that Britain was changed by Elizabeth Robins. Her impact, but what I would say is that her impact was primarily on London, especially the London stage. And by the time she died, she was actually fast becoming forgotten. Mm-hmm. However, her impact on theatre was certainly profound. She was one of the key figures in introducing London and beyond to Ibsen's work in English. Her Hedda and her insistence on her as neither wholly good nor bad was significant. Hedda, she felt, could be seen as sympathetically unsympathetic. And she's had an impact, therefore, on how Hedda has been played and interpreted over the decades. Just as the Robins Lee management team for women had an impact on women and the theatre. And of course, it was not just her acting in Ibsen's great prose dramas that we should applaud. The experience already gained on the American stage across the States had given her a head start, even if people didn't know much about it. Mm. She was already a seasoned actress. And this, combined with her bravery in starting all over again in a world where she had to really do an awful lot to make her mark, made her, and particularly at the same time as helping defray her mother's medical expenses, all of that was no mean feat. So I think that she did make an impact, but it was in certain areas and in certain ways.
We were talking via email before the interview about different things getting ready for this and the fact that Elizabeth's materials were not accessible right away when she passed. So what difference do you see in how her legacy has changed from the 20th century to where we are now in the 21st century?
I think there's been quite a change because people can read her words in a way they couldn't before. Modern theatre critics have assessed her significance in not just Ibsen's work, but in plays like Alan's Wife. It's interesting, if you go to see, and this has been true now for quite a few decades, if you go to see either Hedda Gabler or The Master Builder on the big stages of London, the National Theatre or the Barbican, those kind of places, whenever they've put on major productions, you invariably have a picture of her in the programme and usually something about her as the pioneer. Her circle of literary friends has also meant that there are kind of ripple effects. So she, for example, there are articles on her in The Wildian, which is a journal devoted to Oscar Wilde. Peter Whitebrook wrote a fine biography of William Archer, in which she's writ large. There's a book on the hospital, Endell Street, where she worked for a short time as a librarian, volunteering during the First World War, and she features in this book. And there are PhD theses on her. An Australian woman, Sue Thomas, has produced a very detailed, chunky booklet on all her many of her publications, a sort of bibliographical guide. Also, there are now plaques both in Henfield and Brighton. I opened my biography back in 1995 with an account of the unveiling of the blue plaque at Baxtertown in 1960. The city of Brighton and Hove unveiled a plaque in June 2021 at 24 Montpellier Crescent to the residents Elizabeth Robbins, actor, writer, suffragette, and Dr. Octavia Wilberforce. Unfortunately, it was during the COVID period, so people couldn't gather to celebrate this. But people can, however, take a regular double-decker bus run by the local authority in the Brighton and Hove area. There's a great policy there of honouring local figures, including, by the way, a local cat who apparently was quite a character, by naming buses after significant characters. And one bus is actually called Elizabeth Robbins. Also, if you go to the Royal Albert Hall in London, the director's box includes a framed poster advertising the vast Votes for Women meeting there in mid-1912 and features Elizabeth as one of the speakers. And of course, you can visit Enfield Museum to learn more about her. And the Women's Library, now housed at the LSE, contains material about Elizabeth. So I think she's become more accessible and more available, particularly, I think, in the early years of the 21st century. It may be there's not been quite so much written on her in very recent years, but I could be wrong there, and I hope I am. And I know that there have been, some plays written about her and performances about her life.
And we'll put a link to the photo of her bus and also to the Henfield Museum's website, because they have some lovely photographs of her that they've done there that would be great for people to see. So you are one of the few people, as you've said, who've really looked into her, and there are getting to be more of us, but you have definitely spent more time with her than almost anybody. Is there anything else that you would want to make sure people understand about Elizabeth?
I think I would just want to reiterate how brave I think she was. Her determination not just to go on stage, but to reinvent herself after a terrible tragedy by starting anew in a foreign country, thousands of miles away from home, at a time when women were open to all sorts of attacks, took real guts. Mm-hmm. And actresses in particular were often seen as available. Actresses and prostitutes were both called public women.
Yeah.
I think that it's difficult sometimes for us, and life can be tough enough for women today, but it's really difficult for us to recognise just how shocking it was for women to be as independent as she was. Mm-hmm. To risk putting on Ibsen's controversial work compounded the difficulties, and to speak out on behalf of women as a suffragette, I think just confirmed this woman's strength of character.
That's really good. No, that's true. And we've talked multiple times about her father and his horror at her wanting to become an actress because it was not viewed particularly well. And he wanted her to be a doctor, which maybe her support for Octavia later was a nod to her dad and helping him live out that dream for her. But as a prolific author yourself, what is your favorite book that Elizabeth wrote?
Well, You mentioned it earlier, and I did find both sides of the curtain especially fascinating, precisely because she works so hard to camouflage herself. And it only covers a very short period of her life. Of course, she did also write Whither and How, which wasn't published, and which in a way takes her life on further. But I find both sides of the curtain a fascinating title for a start. And it's also far from being a traditional autobiography. I think The Convert is my favourite piece of fiction that she wrote, because I find it extremely rich, largely because it is written from within the movement. So I think it's a really significant novel. But I would also say that my favourite writing by Elizabeth isn't actually a published book or even one of her amazing unpublished short stories. It's actually her own diary. That to me is a tour de force and something that proves that truth is stranger than fiction. Though, of course, when and whether she revealed the truth is a moot point and a fascinating one. So she keeps us on our toes.
Absolutely. And I will say my favorite part of The Convert is that opening where the main character is interacting with her niece and nephew in the nursery. And I love the way that she took the suffrage movement and opened it up by talking about a woman in a nursery with children, and just kind of catches you off guard thinking this is a very traditional thing, and then hopefully making you see that women can care about kids and about voting at the same time. And it's just brilliant. And also just any time she portrays kids, I think she does a beautiful job from a
does subvert continually and take us by surprise. And I think that's what.
So before we go, would you share with us your latest writing project?
Well, I've got a new book coming out on the 8th of April, published initially in the UK. I hope it will get published, or at least certainly distributed in the States before too long. It's called, interestingly enough, it's got a title that's not unlike Elizabeth, Both Sides of the Curtain in some ways. It's called Behind the Scenes, The Dramatic Lives of Philip Burton, because Philip Burton was, like Elizabeth, somebody who was, well, he was described once as a theatrical maniac. He was totally stage struck. His life virtually spanned the 20th century, and he was the Welsh schoolmaster initially who discovered and trained and transformed his pupil, Richard Jenkins, into the acting legend that became Richard Burton. And this year is the centenary of Richard Burton's birth. So Philip is best known for that. And in fact, there's about to be a new feature film in which explores that relationship between the two of them, with Toby Jones playing Philip. And it comes out at the same time as my book. Oh, wow. And Philip Burton was a playwright. He became a BBC producer. He was a writer. He was a theatre director, you name it. And in 1954, in his middle age, he emigrated to the States. So he went in the other direction from Elizabeth. He left Wales and London, and he went to America, where he spent the rest of his long life, more or less the second half of the century. He died in 1995. And he was the first director and president of the American Musical and Dramatic Academy, New York's drama school that's still flourishing today. And he was really a Shakespeare expert. He gave sparkling lecture recitals across the States on Shakespeare, wrote 5 books, one of them a piece of fiction about Shakespeare's brother, another a study for actors, really, primarily, of some of the leading characters in Shakespeare's plays. And he spent the last quarter of a century of his life in Key West, where he was a leading figure amongst the kind of literary intelligentsia based in Key West. So, like Elizabeth, he was another fascinating and multi-talented figure who lived a long and productive life, devoted to the stage and page, and he straddled the Atlantic.
Well, that sounds brilliant. Very exciting. So where can people go to find out more about your work? Well,
my publisher is Parthian Books, and their website is www.parthianbooks.com. And my own website is www.angelavjohn.com. So if you go to the Parthian website, you can actually pre-order the book if you want. So it is available now. And there's a picture of it up on their website. And I think it's something like pre-ordering or something, but that doesn't commit you. You can have a look at what it's about.
Yeah, and we'll put links to both of those things up, as well as a cover photo of the book. It's very exciting. Such an honor to get to know you and have read your book. I guess it was about 10 years ago the first time I read it. So to actually get to speak with you has been amazing, and I appreciate your time.
Well, thank you so much. And it's lovely to meet you and to hear about all the wonderful work that you have been doing at Cinsigat and continue to do with giving people tours and all kinds of things, and this marvelous online facility which opens it up for more people.
Though it was tragedy that initially brought Elizabeth to England, her friendships and career opportunities are what kept her there. People like Florence and Gertrude Bell, Henry James, and William Archer challenged her intellect and expanded her talent. I'm glad to see Britain still remembers and honors her, and can't wait to share more about her estate at Baxet Town. But that is a story for another podcast. Thank you for listening to the Elizabeth Robbins Diary podcast, which is made possible with the help of the brilliant minds of our guest experts like Dr. Angela V. John. It is such an honor to talk to people who are way further along in their research than I am. Besides the joy of learning, they inspire me to keep going. Would you please consider following and rating the podcast? By following us, you'll be sure not to miss an episode. When you provide a rating, you help more people find us and support all the hard work of the following people. Leif Thomason of Odd Life Studios produced this content, as well as editing, mixing, and mastering it. Elisa Babor and Barry Mindel of Roots Creative Co. designed an easy-to-navigate website and our lovely graphics. Go to the website for links about Elizabeth in England and photos of some of the people we mentioned today. Randy Olson of Live Oak Theater wrote and performed our beautiful theme song, Time is Whispering. Fales Library of New York University gave me access to Elizabeth's collection. Those resources are quoted with the kind permission of Independent Age. Find out more about them at independentage.org. Gary Fellumley of Muskingum County History Museum helped me get in contact with Dr. John. This episode would not have happened without him. Also, I don't want to break my streak of mentioning Theodore Roosevelt in all the episodes this season. When Elizabeth was writing her 1891 diary entry, TR was writing and publishing New York, a sketch of the city's social, political, and commercial progress from the first Dutch settlement to recent times. This was one of over 35 books TR wrote, in between his political and military careers and family life. But Roosevelt was not only a prolific writer, he was a good one. Check out a couple links to his writing we have in the show notes. And finally, as always, much thanks to Elizabeth Robbins. Her endlessly fascinating life makes executive producing, writing, and hosting this telling of her story so delightful and easy.